hi to everyone on the line and in the room. So before I start off, I'd like to do this little exercise. If you could please share with me what words come to mind when you think of corporate net zero commitments. And you can answer this question by going to menti.com and using this code 4712 or 2980. If you have your phone handy, you can just like look at this QR code and you can then pop in words that come to mind when you think of net zero commitments. If you're on the call, I believe that link that I just dropped into the channel will get you there. So let me, while you're doing that, some of the things that you all are commenting on. Yeah, I see offsetting, greenwashing, skepticism, a PR initiative, ill-motivated, a scam, performative. Yeah, I would say generally speaking, if I'm to summarize some of these comments that you're putting in here, the responses lead towards distrust of net zero commitments and probably very few views that net zero commitments are positive for our fight for climate. So let's talk about this a little bit more and talk about what we want to see of companies when we're talking about, when we're looking at their net zero commitments. So thank you for that. I will pop back to my slides here. And can you see that? Or did they not work?
We still see the poll.
Okay. I lost them. Sorry, let me try again. I'm having a technical error. I'm having
Welcome to the Zoom era. We are all sympathetic.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Try again. Okay. Let's see. There we go.
There we go.
All right. So before I dive into the part about net zero, let me just frame up what natural climate solutions are. So oftentimes, natural climate solutions refer to a variety of actions that protect, improve, or restore natural or working lands. So very classic examples of this are avoiding deforestation, which keeps forests standing, which is a way to reduce emissions. You can improve the management of agriculture or timberlands, which maintains carbon stored in very key soil and biomass pools. Or you can restore forests or wetlands, which is another way of sequestering carbon. And essentially all of these activities, not just sequester, but they also store their carbon in biomass. And natural climate solutions are very, according to the scientists, a very important component of our attempt to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. They can provide up to 30% of the emission reductions that are needed to get us there. And then the other really key thing is that natural climate solutions can provide carbon removals at comparatively low cost compared to the technological options that are available today. As you can see in this graph, they kind of are at the lower end of cost, whereas direct air carbon capture and storage can cost upwards of like $600 a ton to remove. So companies are using natural climate solutions in a few different ways. And when I talk about natural climate solutions, like I mentioned, there are ways to sequester, remove, or reduce emissions through, protecting or restoring ecosystems. And there's also a way in which these types of activities can be turned into carbon credits. And then those carbon credits are used for companies to offset their emissions. So that's one way that people rely on natural climates, or companies rely on natural climate solutions. That's the third bullet here. But companies that have land in their value chain, like food and beverage companies, for example, they can implement natural climate solutions, or they can help support the implementation of natural climate solutions within their value chains to reduce their overall scope 3 emissions, or their value chain emissions. And then some companies just foresee that carbon credits are going to have greater value down the line, and they're investing in carbon credits and they're looking at it as a business opportunity. But the one piece that gets a lot of criticism and attention is this last bullet, which is when companies are purchasing off carbon credits from natural climate solutions and using them towards their net zero goals. So as you all sort of alluded to, there's lots of skepticism and critiques of net zero commitments. And when you break it down, the commitments come down to things like folks are skeptical because they feel that companies are delaying action. When companies only set 2050 goals, for example, they might not be taking the action that they need today to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC models show that to reach net zero emissions by 2050, we have to have our global emissions by 2030. So the decade for action is now, and companies need to know how they're going to reach that 2030 goal in order to be able to actually achieve the 2050 goal. Some companies also omit some of the key emissions sources that they are responsible for. So for example, some companies only address their direct emissions from their operations, but many companies' operations and products and services also cause indirect emissions, either upstream or downstream. And if they're not thinking about those impacts, then they're omitting, some of their responsibility in addressing emission reductions. There's criticism that there's an over-reliance on offsetting. So companies that buy carbon credits to offset their emissions rather than actually spending the resources necessary to implement measures that reduce emissions directly. And then also there's poor accountability. Companies can make any kind of commitment they want. No one really understands what they're about. And no one's policing them or forcing companies to actually do good. So understandably, some of the sentiments that you reflected at the top of this presentation, it's understandable that you would feel that way about net zero commitments. So as Sarah mentioned, CERES works with investors, and what we're often doing is explaining to them the business case about why they need to take these things into consideration. And admittedly, the business case is not the only reason why companies should do this stuff, but it's oftentimes the reason that resonates. And when companies don't appropriately use natural climate solutions or carbon credits, then they are going to be exacerbating the risk of climate change, because there could be no actual emissions happening. And as we know today, more and more companies are actually threatened by climate change. Like the deep freeze in Texas slowed down all of life, and many companies took a hit. They were having quite a hard time bouncing back from that. And so there is an economic reason for them to pay attention to this issue. But at the same time, there are also more customers as well as employees and just, like shareholders and general public, they want companies to be responsible climate actors. And people like probably your young selves are willing to choose products or services or companies that have good environmental credentials and are willing to not purchase products from companies that have bad environmental credentials. And so again, that creates a risk for companies. So how do companies think about reducing these risks when they're using natural climate solutions? So the key things is that we want them to rely on natural climate solutions in a way that raises the ambition of their climate commitments. And I'll talk about that more. We also want to make sure that the natural climate solutions are actually providing credible climate change mitigation. For example, there is the critique that you're just going to plant a tree and then no one checks on the tree, and whether or not that tree is ever sequestering carbon, we don't know because there's no verification of that activity. So we don't want kind of blank promises that these trees are being planted and they're not truly actually supporting our climate ambition. And then also we want natural climate solutions that have social and environmental benefits. Oftentimes these types of activities are implemented in places that are not just, that are not separate from the people and the places where they're located. They're integral, oftentimes forests and humans, or, working lands, farmers, ranchers. People and places are integral, and we need to think about how natural climate solutions can provide positive impacts for society as well as the environment. So to break down each of these a little bit more, when we talk about raising the ambition of climate commitments, what we want to see is that companies are reducing their emissions following a 1.5 degree pathway, because what we understand is that limiting warming to 1.5 is our best chance at mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. And so there are many models that have been developed and many of them are kind of identified in the IPCC, and they all kind of show that between now and 2030, we need to have our emissions. And then between 2030 and 2050, we need to reach virtually net zero emissions. And there are different pathways for different sectors. For example, the steel sector might have a harder time decarbonizing today, whereas the power generation sector should have an easier time to decarbonize between now and 2050. And so the orange line is like the target, the ideal target. And so as companies are moving down this pathway, each year we should see, what we want to see is that their corporate emissions, their corporate footprint follows that orange line, like you can see in the gray bars, the dark gray bars. And as companies get closer to 2050 and net zero, there are going to be emissions that we call residual emissions. And they're basically emissions that are like not feasible to abate. And this is the case in some sectors. For example, in cement, it is necessary to use carbon dioxide, and there are unavoidable carbon dioxide emissions in the process of making cement. Likewise, in the food and agriculture sector, beef through enteric fermentation releases methane, and there are ways to reduce the methane emissions from enteric fermentation, but they are probably not possible to completely eliminate. And so those will continue to be sources of emissions, but to reach net zero, which implies some math involved, we have to remove a certain amount of carbon from the atmosphere as well. And so as we get closer to net zero, natural climate solutions are a way to remove those emissions. Trees going through the process of photosynthesis, sequestering carbon, storing that carbon in their biomass. Those are ways to remove emissions. So as we get closer to net zero, companies can use carbon credits from removals to help them achieve that balance of net zero emissions. And then also on the way to net zero, companies can purchase carbon credits from projects to sort of go beyond what they're required to do, and also support the global ambition of reducing emissions and funneling finance and support to these types of projects, which are really valuable for us hitting this goal. And in order to ensure that these credits can provide credible climate change mitigation, they need to be verified. They need to follow a standard of accounting of their greenhouse gas emission reductions or removals. And then they need to be measured periodically, somewhere between annually or some 5 to 10 years. And then the results of those emission reductions and removals need to be verified. And then when they go through that process, following the standards that are I've put here on the screen, then you can be assured that these projects are actually reducing or removing emissions. And then there have been, and you've probably heard, news reports about certain carbon credits that might be overstating their climate ambition. And that's kind of like one of the tricky factors of engaging in the carbon market, but we kind of encourage that companies do extra due diligence to look through the details of the projects, ask lots of questions to make sure that they're investing in credits that are truly credible and generating a carbon benefit. And then we also want projects to provide social and environmental benefits. As I mentioned before, natural climate solutions have a massive potential to protect biodiversity, improve soil health, decrease erosion, improve water quality or quantity. And then also, depending on where they're located or how they're designed, they can also provide sources of income for rural landowners or local communities. On the flip side, if these projects are not appropriately designed and implemented, they can have really detrimental impacts on the people and the places where they're located. So natural climate solutions, and especially the forest-based products, the ones that avoid harm and generate benefits, they're characterized by paying attention to the social and environmental issues during the design and execution of the project. For example, reforestation projects should be using native species. There should be a diversity of species. Those trees should be suited to the location. When it comes to projects that involve people, there should be clear land title, clear delineation of land rights. There should be equitable sharing of benefits. The people in these areas should have access to legal counsel, and they should have, lots of information to help them inform their decisions about participating. And then they should have opportunities for expressing their grievances if the projects aren't going well. So similar to the carbon side of things, so there are programs that certify the social and environmental benefits of projects. So on this graph here, I've got, or this Venn diagram, I have on the left side, the greenhouse gas programs. These programs certify that projects are reducing emissions and removals. And then on the right-hand side, we have the programs that certify the social and environmental benefits. And then in the middle here are programs that look at both factors. And so when a project is, when somebody goes and implements a project that's either reducing deforestation or planting trees, they would go through the process following the accounting and the methods that are set out in one of these different standards. If they take, for example, a project, they follow a methodology under the verified carbon standard for looking at carbon, then they should pair that with a climate, community, and biodiversity standard so that they can demonstrate both benefits to climate as well as environment and people. So what I kind of highlighted today are that when companies are using natural climate solutions, they need to raise the ambition of their climate commitments. They have to provide credible climate change mitigation, and they also need to have social and environmental benefits. But as we talked about when we're looking at the critiques of net zero, companies are not really transparent about not just their net zero targets, but also what they're doing to achieve those targets. And so we are calling for companies to be more transparent and to disclose not just their targets for 2050 and earlier, but also progress against those targets and how they're doing in terms of achieving their 1.5 degree C goal. We also want to know how much of their targets are going to be met through the use of carbon credits. And this allows us to understand whether companies are actually trying to help raise the ambition of achieving 1.5 degrees C, or if they're just greenwashing and putting off their commitments, and they're not really, maybe they're purchasing a ton of credits, and they're not really hitting their short and medium targets. Or if they are hitting their short and medium targets and they're purchasing credits, then you can feel better about the progress that the company is making. And then when it comes to the use of credits, we want to see that companies are purchasing credits that are certified. So they're not just kind of, saying like, oh yeah, we helped plant 1 trillion trees. And so we have this environmental benefit, and it's kind of like unaccounted for, it's not measured, and we might not really know if those trees are still standing. And then we also want to make sure that the social and environmental benefits are also being certified. So company, again, it's demonstrating that people have been appropriately consulted. If we're planting trees, they're using native species, and it's a diversity of species, and that it's like suitable to the environment. And ultimately, by calling for increased transparency with companies, then we can have a better idea of these net zero targets that we are all so skeptical about. And if they can show this information to us, then not only do we have greater confidence, but then we'll also be actually working on achieving our goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. So that's all that I have for you. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions because this is quite a fascinating topic. And so, yeah, I'll open the floor.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And we'll start with a couple of questions that we have in the Q&A. So feel free to keep them coming, the same for the room. And I'll pass you the microphone. So the first question we have is from the students the Tufts Civic semester. Their question is, how does CERES interact with the land back movements and indigenous sovereignty when negotiating natural climate solutions?
Okay, I'm not fully familiar with the land back movement. Is this a North America-based initiative to make sure that indigenous people can have their native lands back?
Here, I can unmute them so they can elaborate on their question. Okay. Tufts Civic semester, you're allowed to use your voice.
What Ms. Ching said about land back is accurate. It's, yes, a North America-based movement to give indigenous people land that was stolen by colonizers.
Yeah, so awesome, that's great. Two clarifications. The first is that we don't CERES itself isn't specifically working on any natural climate solutions projects. However, we're trying to provide guidance for people who are purchasing credits from natural climate solutions projects, or potentially even just engaging themselves and trying to develop projects that are reducing or removing emissions. And we are currently working on a subsequent guidance document, which covers in more detail how to safeguard the people where these projects are located. It's actually social and environmental safeguards, not just social safeguards. And these safeguards take a look at, so when you're, essentially what this means is when you're developing a project, that project needs to look out for and respect the rights of Indigenous people in local communities. It needs to help with land access and tenure. It needs to make sure that there's full and effective participation. This is also known as FPIC, and this can be quite an involved process of informing people in the language that they are, making sure that they have counsel, making sure that they fully understand the impacts of the project, providing consent in a way, and then making sure that participation is balanced. So it's not just the leaders of the community, but also the women and marginalized people of communities. And then a few other things. And so when developing those types of projects, one of the key things that we look at that we're recommending that people look at is not just, so the first two things, respect for Indigenous people and local communities, which is kind of a broad on respecting their culture, their tradition, their customary traditions, which aren't always put in law, and then looking at land tenure and land rights. And so in developing countries, for example, there are a few Indigenous people whose rights aren't recognized, or their rights to land aren't recognized. The government might technically hold the rights to that land. And so this guidance sort of encourages people to respect those rights and make sure that they understand that, not all land is just open to being purchased. But we don't have specific work in trying to support tribes in North America or the US for receiving their land back. But there are tribes who have done this. The York tribe, that's based out of Northern California, they have used carbon projects they've purchased the land from a timber company. It's their traditional land. They purchased land from the timber company, started protecting it. So they're reducing the amount of timber that was previously being harvested. They're receiving credits for that, and then generating credits from that, receiving payments by selling those credits, and then they're able to buy back more land. And then increasingly, they're able to also implement activities like restoring beaver and steelhead and salmon habitat. And so the natural climate solutions have a way of supporting tribes in reclaiming land, or being having a way to generate income off of the land that they have. And there are a few organizations that are helping tribes to think about that. But it doesn't specifically help with it, but it's a way to help, make that easier in some instances.
Great. Thank you. The next question from Anne Erlin. It sounds like company considerations of these issues is all still voluntary. Given that this is an existential threat, can you speak to the role of regulations and enforcement appropriate to the facts this is an existential threat? Yeah,
thanks. So in an ideal world, companies would be regulated to drive down their emissions. In an ideal world, when Biden set an NDC for the US to reduce its emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050, that would follow with a set of regulation and legislation that would help drive down emissions throughout our entire country. I would love to see that, but that's not really happening at the moment. And in the meantime, companies can voluntarily take action to do what they need to do and take responsibility for their emissions. And so this is all in the voluntary space because of a lack of regulation and enforcement. And there are many organizations that are emerging that are trying to, and have always been around as well, that are trying to make sure that this voluntary action is at the highest level of ambition, that companies are doing what they say, what they're claiming to do, and trying to reach robust targets. And so, for example, the science-based targets initiative is a way for companies to set 20 interim goals that are like 5 years out, 2025-ish, to 2050 goals that are aligned with science. There are ways to, actually, the dean of your school, Dr. Rachel Kite, is this co-chair of the initiative, the voluntary carbon market initiative, which is meant to bring voluntary carbon market integrity initiative, which is meant to bring integrity around the types of claims that companies can make about what they're doing on the way to reaching their net zero commitments, and then a number of other things. And so it is voluntary, because we don't have regulation. And so in the meantime, what we're trying to do is drive the highest ambition of voluntary action.
So since you mentioned TAPS, I'm going to ask a question about TAPS. So it's again from the TAPS civic semester students. They say, TAPS also has a net zero 2050 goal. Does CERES work with any academic institutions? And in your opinion, does the way NCS are implemented change in any way outside of an explicit corporate context?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of that question, Sarah?
So is the way that the NCS implemented, is it different depending if it's if they are implemented outside of a corporate context?
I think all of the same ideas would apply regardless of whether or not you're a company or an academic institution. There are, I think like for an academic institution, the boundaries of where the greenhouse gas emissions come from are different. In a company that makes a product, that company is going to have supply chains that go really far up, like you have your computer, but then that computer needed chips, and then you also needed like little screws, and you also needed some aluminum and some glass and whatever, and all of those things contribute to the value chain emissions of a company. And when it comes to an academic institution, there might be less upstream and downstream emissions, and so that might be like a slightly different boundary, but I think the ideas still apply. The buildings that are part of the school, they use electricity, which is a source of emissions. All of the ways that you all commute to and from school are a source of emissions. If you live on campus, how much you use heat or light or just run random electrical appliances, again, uses emissions. And so those are all ways in which an academic institution can think about driving down those emissions. And likewise, on the trajectory to 1.5, reducing by half by 2030, like all of these things apply across the board. This is what we need to do as society. And so you can break these same guidelines down to also apply to a school, I think.
So following up on that question, there is another one asking whether there are certain companies or industries, whether they are just fundamentally unsustainable, such as the extractive companies like mining, and they wonder if it would be it makes sense for them to use these natural climate solutions, if they are supposed to be complementary rather than just taking over instead of reducing your emissions.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting philosophical question. I think that there are certain people who work in the space of natural climate, like they're the folks who are developing projects. Like I mentioned, like, for example, the York tribe, that's in Northern California, who is protecting forests and selling their credits. They don't want to sell credits to oil and gas companies because they feel that, what oil and gas companies are doing is directly destroying the thing that they're trying to save. And I can see the rationale for that, and I fully respect that decision. But I think like oil and gas companies as well, like the imperative for them for us to reach 2050 is basically like we need to move away almost completely from fossil fuels. And so these companies need to disappear. Very few companies kind of think about that as their future. The models show that by 2050, there will only be, I'm going to butcher this statistic, but it's like 20% of our fossil fuel usage of what we are today, because we're still going to need some. And so every fossil fuel company is trying to be that last standing 20%, but that's not going to be possible. There's going to have to be companies that go away. So, you know, in an ideal world, maybe mining companies wouldn't be buying natural climate solutions. However, I also believe that if we don't maximize our natural climate solutions, then we'll be also relying on technological solutions. And I think some of the technological solutions that are out there have also some kind of scary geoengineering or potentially negative impacts. And so, you know, I think from my own personal perspective is that come from a place of we should do everything we can to protect nature and help nature be the net sink that it needs to be in the future. And if that means that a mining company is going to spend, you know, billions of dollars in helping to protect forests or restoring the land that they're mining on or whatever it might be, then that might be better than moving, you know, relying really heavily on like direct air carbon capture and storage, for example.
Thank you. There is another question to follow up on that one, and it's about the type of emissions. So you mentioned downstream emissions, upstream emission, and most companies maybe only report the emissions of making a product, but there are a lot more, and you divided them in the different scopes. So the question is, are there any companies that are actually reducing Scope 3 emissions? And if so, what are the sources of those emissions and how are they reducing them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those of you who are not familiar, when you look at a corporate greenhouse gas emissions footprint, we break them down into 3 scopes. Scope 1 are your direct emissions. So that would be, let's take Apple as an example. Their direct emissions are going to be the emissions from operating their building, from if they actually physically own factories, if Apple itself physically owns a factory, it would be the emissions of operating that factory. Their Scope 2 emissions are the emissions from electricity that they use, because most buildings don't have on-site electricity generation. Many factories might have on-site electricity generation, but many buildings get their electricity from the grid. And then Scope 3 are all of the emissions that are upstream or downstream. So in the making of your iPhone, a factory in Taiwan, you know, assembled all of the pieces, and to operate that factory, there were emissions to run to operate. But then not all of the screws and the glass and the chips and the plastic, you know, whatever, the aluminum, not all of that came from that factory. They sourced that from a number of different places. So all of these are like upstream sources. And then downstream, and I could be mixing up upstream and downstream, I always get it wrong, I apologize, but downstream, we're using our iPhones. And every other night, I charge my iPhone. And this is also a source of emissions that would be included in the Scope 3 of Apple. So companies can help to reduce Scope 3 emissions by, for example, making their products more energy efficient, because when we go to plug them in, then we are also using less electricity. Companies can also work with the factories or the places where they source their materials and help them implement renewable energy. You know, for example, some places are helping factories in China like install a suite of solar across their roofs so that those factories can operate on renewable energy. And so, yeah, there are a few companies that are implementing various techniques like this. In the food and beverage sector, you have some of the big like ag companies where they're going door to door, working with farmers, trying to teach them new techniques that can help reduce the emissions, so that like down the line, when you eat your cereal, you know, your cereal is lower emissions. So it's definitely happening, but it's really hard because oftentimes we only know like 1 or 2 steps upstream. You know, for example, you and I, we go to the grocery store, we buy from, you know, say it's Whole Foods, but then Whole Foods has to buy groceries, its products from a suite of other retailers or wholesale retailers. And those people buy things from, you know, further up. And so a few steps down the chain, we start losing sight of like the actual facility that was producing those emissions. And so it's harder to engage the further upstream you have to go. And because some of these facilities serve many companies, you know, like if Whole Foods is buying flour from the flour company, that the company that is milling the flour, they could be milling flour for many companies, you know, like King Arthur Bakery, Gold Standard, Gold Flour, White Lily Flour, whatever, you know, and so those emissions then get spread across a lot of different products and people. And anyways, it can get really messy. And so it can be hard for companies to understand their scope 3 emissions, which is why it is one of the biggest blocks in helping us to reduce emissions.
And we just had another question coming that I think relates to this one, essentially saying, do you think electric vehicles are the right way to go since non-green infrastructure is needed to support it, the toxicity of the batteries, etc.?
Well, I'll give you my personal opinion, which, you know, by no means is the best opinion. But I think that climate change, if we don't solve climate change, there's no point in solving our other issues, our other environmental issues, because climate change will be so devastating that, you know, I think potentially it can just be that disruptive. And so mining for like rare earth minerals is also destructive. But maybe it's a more localized destruction than what would happen with climate change if we just allowed ourselves to go beyond the 1.5 degrees C. And so I don't like pitting one environmentalist against the other. I think we're all on the same Noah's Ark boat trying to keep, you know, Earth alive. But I do think that there are some, you know, when we think about like what we can do to even be here in 2050, it does seem that, you know, moving to electric is going to be better than continuing to pump fossil fuels into the air, or thinking that we can just use technologies like carbon capture and storage to remove all of that carbon dioxide and put it into the earth crust. You know, like all of these things are unknown, but what we do know today is that climate change is so destructive, we have to do something about it. And some things will probably have to give, but if we don't deal with it, then it doesn't really matter. Everything's going to be gone. That's my own personal view. I don't know how many people agree with me. And so I'm just putting that out there.
Thank you. Alexandra Thorne wonders whether grasslands are included as possible paths to carbon sequestration and how that intersects with agriculture, ruminant grazing, and the presence of wild ruminant animals on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So protecting native grasslands is a key way to, you know, a key natural climate solution. It's a lot like protecting standing forests. Native grasslands can have a ton of carbon in the soil. There is some evidence, although, and you may have heard some of this through in your experiences, but there is some evidence that it's hard to restore the carbon that's been lost, and know almost, you know, you can implement like regenerative agriculture techniques. You can implement like rotational grazing and all kinds of things, but it's not clear how much additional carbon we're storing in the soil. But this is a key solution. And it is something that many people are working on. Wild ruminants. I'm curious, if you can, I'd love if you could elaborate, because like, for example, in a properly native natural ecosystem, ruminants are essential for the grassland to be maintained because of the whole like circulation of nutrients and stuff.
Right.
There are many places where the ruminants aren't truly wild. We put them there. And we use those animals. We feed, we graze them on this land because it's free and available, but not necessarily essential.
Right. So where I was going with this is there's like, I mean, a big piece of the climate activism right now is everyone needs to go vegan. And then meanwhile, there's these regenerative agricultural people who are saying, oh, rotational grazing is going to save everything. And it mimics the natural movement of things like bison herds across the landscape. And so there's a little bit like, there's so much concern about methane. And I don't know how much thought is being put into the fact that ruminants have always been there, and that maybe there's a way of managing them that that mimics natural processes, or that if you actually restore the prairie and bring back the wild bison, that there'll be carbon impacts there that people just aren't thinking about because it's like it's not caused by humans. And so it's kind of like interested in how CERES is navigating all of that.
That's I suspect that there are some scenarios that there truly are scenarios where restoring the wild grazing is actually, you could also consider like restoring the grassland ecosystem, and that type of activity is a way to sequester carbon and reduce emissions. And it's kind of like, taking the land back. It's like I would equate that to like taking timberland back and just turning it back into a forest, and I think that there's certainly a place for a project like that. But separately, there's also the question of, in order to reach 2050 net zero by 2050, 1.5 by 2050, we probably need to phase away from meat. And the question is, how far do we need to phase away, and how do we make that an equitable and just type of solution globally? Because there are many places in the world that do not eat as much meat as we do, but it's also a part of their culture. It could also be a part of their wealth, and it could also be a part of their financial stability. And so there are, it's a good, reducing your meat intake is a great solution in the developed country context. There are certainly arguments for not pushing that, as a global solution. Which is a separate point entirely, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Tina Wilson, the Director of the Office of Sustainability here at TAPS. She says, one of the biggest critiques of natural carbon reduction solutions is that they are temporary. Trees can be cut down even though they are protected, or future landowners decide not to follow the contract. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that is a huge concern. And the greenhouse gas programs that I mentioned during the presentation, which certify the emission reductions, they have created sort of like administrative ways to manage that permanence. So if we're looking at like the carbon credit side of things, there is a level of a risk of non-permanence which is what we would call it. And that exists, but like from a crediting perspective, we've kind of developed ways to deal with that, which is there are buffering accounts. Every natural climate solutions project has to deposit a set of credits into this account that cannot be traded, and they're like an insurance pool. But from the global perspective of natural climate solutions, I think one thing to think about and keep in mind is that a tree might be, it might have like a 100-year lifespan, or if we're very lucky, 5,000-year lifespan. But ecosystems, they have really long lifespans. They've been around for millennia. And so one tree might go, as we think about like natural climate solutions, and as we think about the opportunity of like using these like trees and grasses and whatnot, we shouldn't just be thinking of them as like individual trees that we're planting, but we should be thinking about how are we like restoring the natural ecosystem, or even the urban ecosystem, where there can be a flux of trees that are going up and coming down, but the overall amount of biomass that we're trying to keep up is high. And so for me, I'd like us to move away from thinking about individual trees and thinking about like the landscape and the forest as a whole when we're thinking about those things.
Thank you. And I'd like to end with this final question, again, from the top civic semester students. They ask, can you talk a bit about how CERES is funded, and also what steps are being taken to prevent profit motives from affecting the integrity of CERES work, and where do you think CERES is going to be in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, CERES is a nonprofit. We get our money from grants, like particularly on the food and forests team. We work, we come up with projects, we apply for grant funding. Some of it is from foundations, some of it is from development agencies. CERES also works with a suite of companies and investors that are trying to push on the climate agenda. They do pay a membership fee to work with CERES, but that only supports like a small sliver of work. And in particular, it supports the work when, like, for example, my CERES colleagues are directly working with those companies and interacting with them. But CERES's agenda absolutely has everything to do with trying to find practicable solutions that can help move companies forward, and companies and investors. And so all of our work is grounded in what can we do to push us closer to 1.5 degrees C. And I think that that's like our mission. And kind of regardless of what our funding is, I would say that like all of the people that work at CERES, like that is also the mission in their heart and that they're trying to achieve, which I think is like hard to see when we look at, how we're funded and all of that.
Well, thank you very much. Let's thank Carolyn one more time.
Oh, thank you. One thing I wanted to flag for you, I don't know how many of you work in this space, but we are currently hiring a research consultant to do some work with us on a part-time basis. It would just be like ad hoc research, I think at max like 20 hours a week. And I don't think it would be that much either. And if you want to check, and it's on this topic of natural climate solutions, carbon markets, and corporate commitments. And if you want to check out that the RFP that we have out, it's on this website here. If you go to our about us section, there's a little procurement opportunities tab where the RFP is posted.
If you can send me the link, that would be great. We'll post it in our newsletters. So if you didn't sign up for our newsletter, I invite everybody to do so before we close. And also remind everybody that next week we have the memorial lecture to honor Professor Jonathan Kenny, who passed away last December. And he'll be on frontline struggles, environmental health, and environmental justice communities. And he will be an in-person speaker. So I will see everybody next week. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.